Okay guys, welcome back to disassembling the small engine. We're on to section 3 right now, and mainly section 3 is pretty straightforward. We're working on the cylinder head, okay? And the first thing we're going to do is we got the valve cover or rocker cover. It's got 4 perimeter bolts. What I'm going to do is I'm going to loosen all 4 bolts like I've talked about before in the past, and I'm going to loosen all in a crisscross pattern. Once I've loosened them all, then I'm going to go ahead and remove them. And they're not that tight, so you won't have to grunt. Try not to lose your hardware like I do. Once you've loosened all 4 bolts, you can remove them in any manner, as long as they're all loose at the same time, more or less. And we definitely don't want to lose the valve cover. We're going to put it in our box of parts, and we're going to take these bolts, and we're going to put them back in the cylinder head so that we know where they belong. We have no questions later on when we're reassembling, just as we have in the entire project. So here we go, valve cover, and there is a gasket. Be careful. And the gasket wanted to stick to the cylinder head and the valve cover at the same time. This is a quart gasket. They have a tendency to rip really easy. It wants to stay to the valve cover. I'm not going to fight it. I'm going to leave it be. I'm going to take that and I'm going to put it with my other parts. I'm going to take my 4 little bolts, and I'm just going to thread them into my cylinder head, like so. Remember, this is always the best way when you're assembling large parts that you're confused about how to put it back together. This will definitely make your job a lot easier. Okay, now, the next step, we got the rocker arms. The way the rocker arms work is they push down on the valves as you rotate the engine. Okay, we'll rotate the engine. You see there, it's going down. This is the exhaust valve close to the muffler that was here, and that would allow the exhaust to enter into the muffler. And we rotate it there. The intake one is opening. There's the carburetors here. It would draw air and fuel into the cylinder head this way. That's the intake. You see how that rotates, okay? Okay, now, nevertheless, we're going to remove them. So I have to use 2 wrenches in this type of project, this type of design. I have an adjustment nut and I have a locking nut. So I'm going to take my 14 millimeter and I'm going to use the box end. The reason why I use the box end, guys, I know in media they always show us using wrenches like this, but most nuts and bolts have 6 sides to them. It's called a hexagon for 6. If I grab it with this side of the wrench, I'm only grabbing 2 out of the 6 sides. Now, in any sort of scenario, 2 out of 6 is not a passing mark. It's not going to be enough holding power, gripping power to hold this nut without damaging it. If I tend to grab this nut with my open end side of the wrench and I pull on it, I push on it, and what will happen was it'll probably round the nut by damaging the sharp edges. Okay, so I'm going to hold it with my box end. Same thing with the locking nut. I'm going to loosen the locking nut now. Okay, it's a little tight. There we go. Once it's loose, I go ahead and remove my locking nut from my exhaust side. I can remove my adjusting nut from my rocker arm. Remove my valve, my rocker arm. Okay, I got my push rod there. So these push rods and rocker arm, the hardware, again guys, guess where we're going to put it? Back on the stud. We have no questions later on where it belongs. Okay? So I can take my hardware from the exhaust side and grab my little resealable bag. I can throw that in there. I can label that exhaust. Right? Exhaust side. Okay? Next, I'm going to do the same thing on the intake. Hold and loosen. And this way here, so I was tight the first time, I'm going to squeeze these 2 with one hand and squeeze it like a set of pliers. And there you go. They loosen right up. Okay, and all by hand now, just making things simple. Remove that, remove that. Oh, look at that. Push rod wanted to come with it, stuck with it a little bit. Try not to drop your hardware like I do all the time. And again, another resealable bag. And I'm going to label this intake. Okay, I'll label that one as intake. I'm going to take my nut here, my adjusting nut, and I'm going to take my locking nut. Alright, now before we go any further, you notice the top of the valves, they're different diameters. On this engine, it has a spacer on the exhaust side. And what am I going to do is I don't want to lose that spacer. If I pull the engine apart, I'm going to turn this upside down, it's going to fall. I'm going to grab my magnet, and I'm going to pull my spacer off, and that came off the exhaust. So I'm going to take that spacer and put it in my exhaust bag. Okay, there we go, right in my exhaust bag right there. Okay, and I can label that exhaust, intake and exhaust. All right, so you guys understand that? Very simple, very straightforward. You can even tell that the exhaust side has a little bit of a positioning, a little bit larger opening there on the valve keep, it's called, and where the spacer will sit. And now, if you forget to put this back in, the engine won't start because it'll be the wrong spacing. Okay. The next step is to remove the cylinder head bolts. And there's 4 cylinder head bolts, guys, and we're going to loosen all 4 in a crisscross pattern. And they're going to be a little bit tight. Okay, crisscross pattern, loosen all 4. Okay, and then remove. See, the cylinder head is real loose now. And again, I'm going to review what the size of nuts and bolts are on this engine are majority metric, and how I tell that they're metric is by looking at the head of the bolt. You can see here there's some numbers on the bolt. Those numbers don't tell me what size the bolt is. Those numbers represent the tensile strength the metal this bolt is made from. What that means, 10.9, you'd have to look up in a chart exactly how much pressure it will hold. It'll hold roughly 10,000 psi at 90% yield strength. Now, that's based on my very foggy memory. Nevertheless, we're not going to worry about the numbers. Those numbers are a means of measuring the strength of the bolt in the metric system. If you're dealing with imperial bolts do not have numbers, they have lines on them, usually 3 or 6 lines. And that'll tell me the strength of the bolt and the imperial measurement, okay? So anyways, take my bolts off. Don't forget the washers, don't lose the washers. Washer there. Hold my cylinder head because I don't want it to fall. Oh, look at that. Washer stayed inside. I'm going to grab my magnet and grab my washer. I'm going to put it back on my bolt for later. And here we are. This is the cylinder head that's going to be coming off. And you got to be careful. Oh, there's a gasket, and again, clumsiness, I dropped it. So this is the cylinder head. The reason why we call this a cylinder head is because it sits over the cylinder. This is a cylinder head gasket. It covers the cylinder, like so. Now you see here, this is called a dowel. The dowels come off. We got to make sure we don't lose them. There should be another dowel on the bottom here. It stayed in the cylinder head. I'm going to see if it comes out, and there you go, it comes out. I'm going to place it right inside the engine block. And the purpose for the dowels is for alignment purposes. So you can see there now, the head gasket holds its weight, and I can simply, when I put the cylinder head back on, it gets placed back into position. So you can see the cylinder head. Let's talk a little bit of, about the cylinder head. Here we have the 2 valves and the spark plug. This section here is called the combustion chamber. This was where all the fuel and air gets burnt in this section. The spark plug sparks between this tiny little gap here, which is roughly 1 millimeter in space. And if there's any fuel in this area, it's mystified fuel with mostly air, and it's going to ignite, start to burn, pushing the piston down. When it pushes the piston down, it rotates the crank, and then momentum brings the piston back up, and then so on and so forth. Okay? Now, the 2 valves, they have different names. We have the intake valve, which when it opens, it pushes down, allowing air and fuel in the cylinder. We're going to squeeze the air and fuel compression. Then we're going to burn the air and fuel, called power stroke. Then we're going to open the exhaust valve, and all the burnt air and fuel is going to exit the cylinder into the muffler. Okay, so that's the cylinder head. Pretty neat, eh? Okay, class, congratulations, you've now completed section 3.